In the heart of rural Appalachia lies a forgotten town shrouded in silence and shadow. When journalist Emma Harper arrives to uncover the truth behind a series of mysterious disappearances, she quickly realizes some secrets are darker than she ever imagined. Haunted by an ancient curse and trapped in a web of chilling rituals, Emma must confront forces beyond human understanding or become the next victim. Are you ready to step into the unknown? Because once you enter, there's no turning back. The first crack of dawn sliced through the dense fog that clung stubbornly to the edge of the Appalachia woods, painting the world in pale, ghostly hues. In the distance, a lone crow's harsh call echoed across the still air, a sound as ancient and unsettling as the secrets buried beneath the soil of this forgotten town. Caleb Monroe pulled his jacket tighter around his lean frame as he stepped off the creaking bus onto the cracked pavement of Miller's Hollow, Ohio. The town was little more than a speck on the map, a place people only whispered about in hushed tones, if they spoke of it at all. Caleb had heard the stories before: disappearances, strange lights flickering in the woods at night, and a curse that seemed to hang like a shroud over the small community. But he didn't come for the legends. He came to escape. Once a promising journalist in Chicago, Caleb's life had spiraled after a tragic accident claimed the life of his younger sister. Haunted by guilt and sleepless nights, he took this assignment in Miller's Hollow as a last chance to find some meaning, some truth buried beneath layers of superstition and silence. The town square was empty at this hour. Old storefronts with peeling paint and boarded-up windows lined the street. A rusted water fountain stood cracked and dry at its center, the only witness to decades of forgotten lives. The local sheriff's office, a squat brick building with faded signage, sat at the corner, its windows dark behind the iron bars. Caleb's boots echoed hollowly as he walked toward the diner perched at the far end of Main Street. The sign above flickered sporadically: Miller's Hollow Cafe. He pushed open the door, and the warm scent of burnt coffee mingled with the faint musk of old wood greeted him. Behind the counter, a heavy-set woman with sharp eyes looked up from a crossword puzzle, sizing him up. "You're new," she said, her voice gravelly but not unkind. "Caleb Monroe?" he offered, managing a tired smile. "Just got in." She nodded. "You're the one from the paper, huh? Well, don't say I didn't warn you. This town's got shadows deeper than the woods out back." Caleb chuckled softly, though unease knotted in his gut. "I'm used to shadows." He took a seat near the window, eyes drifting to the fog-shrouded hills beyond the edge of town. The waitress brought over a steaming cup without being asked. "Coffee's on the house for folks brave enough to stick around," she said, her gaze lingering on him. As Caleb sipped, his thoughts wandered to the stories he'd read. The disappearances dating back over 50 years, the burned-out homestead on the Miller farm, and most chilling of all, the legend of the Whispering Hollow, a cursed patch of forest said to trap the souls of those who dared enter. He pulled out a worn notebook, flipping to a page marked with his hastily scrawled notes. The locals were tight-lipped, and the Historical Society's records were sparse at best. Still, one name recurred in every tale: Agnes Miller, the last of the original settlers, rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals to protect her family, and possibly cursed the land in the process. Outside, the wind stirred the skeletal branches of bare trees, sending a flurry of dead leaves skittering across the cracked sidewalks. Caleb felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him, the sensation prickling his skin. As he prepared to leave the diner, the woman behind the counter leaned in. "You'll want to visit the old church ruins on the East Ridge before nightfall. Folks say you can still hear the choir singing at dusk, even though it burned down decades ago." Caleb nodded, feeling the pull of the town's history tightening around him like a noose. Every whispered warning, every shadowed glance, seemed to beckon him deeper into the mystery. His footsteps quickened as he made his way toward the outskirts, where the trees grew thick and the air tasted colder. The sun climbed higher, but the forest swallowed the light, casting long, tangled shadows that seemed to pulse with life. The church ruins emerged through the mist, a skeletal frame of charred timber and crumbling stone. An eerie silence wrapped the place, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves. Caleb's breath caught as he noticed faint markings etched into the foundation. Symbols he couldn't decipher, but which stirred a deep unease in his chest. As he crouched to examine the symbols, a sudden chill washed over him, and the distant echo of a melancholic melody floated on the breeze. Goosebumps rose along his arms. The legends were more than stories. They were warnings. Turning away, Caleb felt a prickling at the back of his neck, the unmistakable sense of being followed. Heart pounding, he broke into a hurried jog back toward town, the shadows behind him lengthening and twisting like living things. By the time he reached his modest rented cabin, a weather-beaten structure on the town's fringe, the sun was sinking below the horizon, bleeding a bruised purple across the sky. Caleb locked the door and pulled the curtains tight, but sleep wouldn't come. Outside, somewhere deep in the woods, a low whisper threaded through the trees, barely audible, yet unmistakably there. A call from the whispering hollow, beckoning him to uncover its secrets or become part of its curse. The night settled over Miller's Hollow like a thick, suffocating blanket. Caleb sat in the dim glow of a single lamp in his rented cabin, the worn wooden walls closing in around him. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes and carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a whisper, or maybe the sigh of the old forest itself. He flipped open his notebook again, scanning through the sparse facts and fragmented accounts he had gathered. The Miller family had once been the heart of this town, their farm sprawling and prosperous until a fire reduced their homestead to ashes decades ago. No one had lived there since, but locals warned to stay far away from the burnt-out ruins. What intrigued Caleb most was the tale of Agnes Miller, the matriarch, whose name was spoken with a mix of fear and reverence. She was said to have been a woman obsessed with protection, not just of her family, but of the land itself. Stories told of strange symbols carved into trees and stones, cryptic rituals performed under the cloak of night, and an unholy pact that bound the family's fate to the forest. A sudden knock at the door made Caleb jump. His heart hammered as he rose and peered through the peephole. No one was there, pulling the swirling fog outside, thick enough to swallow a man whole. When he opened the door, a cold gust swept in, carrying with it a dried, brittle leaf etched with the same strange symbols he'd seen at the church ruins. He clutched it tightly, a shiver running down his spine. The marking seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight, as if alive. Sleep was impossible. Caleb's mind raced with questions, and despite the exhaustion weighing on his limbs, he found himself compelled to explore further. The townsfolk's warnings echoed in his head. Stay out of the forest after dark. The Hollow doesn't like strangers. Some secrets are better left buried. Against his better judgment, Caleb wrapped a coat around his shoulders and stepped outside into the night. The fog had thickened, swirling like a living entity around the skeletal trees. The path toward the Miller farm was barely visible, swallowed by shadows and fallen leaves. As he moved deeper into the woods, the temperature dropped sharply. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, tinged with something metallic, almost like blood. Every crunch of his boots on the underbrush seemed unnaturally loud, breaking the eerie silence. The ruins came into view, a twisted skeleton of charred beams and scorched stone. Moonlight filtered through the broken roof, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Caleb approached cautiously, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Then he saw it, a faint glow emanating from the center of the ruins, flickering like candlelight but without any visible source. Drawn by a mixture of dread and curiosity, Caleb stepped closer. There, on the cracked stone floor, lay a circle of strange symbols, etched deep and filled with a substance that glistened like wet ink. Around the circle were scattered remnants of old candles, half melted and blackened, and fragments of what looked like dried herbs. Caleb's breath caught. This was no ordinary ruin. It was a ritual site, active and recent. Suddenly, a chill wind swept through the clearing, snuffing out the faint glow. The shadows pressed in, thickening like smoke, and Caleb felt a presence, something unseen but palpably malevolent, watching him. A low whisper curled around his ears, unintelligible, but laced with warning. His skin prickled, and his heart pounded in his throat. He wanted to run, to escape this place and the dark secret it held, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. Then a figure emerged from the fog. At first, Caleb thought it was a trick of the light, just another tree shaped by shadows. But as the figure stepped closer, he saw her clearly. A woman, draped in tattered black, her eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Her face was pale and lined, marked by time and sorrow, yet her gaze was piercing and ancient. "You shouldn't be here," she said, voice a low rasp that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. Caleb swallowed hard but forced himself to speak. "Who are you?" "The last of the Millers," she replied, eyes never leaving his, "and the guardian of this curse." He wanted to ask more, but a sudden crack echoed through the woods, a branch breaking under heavy footsteps. The woman's expression twisted into something unreadable. "They're coming," she warned, "the ones bound by the old blood." Before Caleb could react, a swarm of dark shapes surged from the trees, moving with unnatural speed and silent menace. His pulse hammered as he backed away, heart slamming against his ribs. The night erupted into chaos as shadowy figures closed in, their forms shifting and indistinct, but their intent unmistakable. Caleb ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, the whispered warnings echoing in his mind. Behind him, the woman's voice pierced the night one last time. "Remember the hollow. Remember the curse." The fog swallowed him whole. The first time Caleb heard the old church bell ring at midnight, he thought it was a trick of his exhausted mind. The soft, mournful toll echoed through the fog-laden streets of Miller's Hollow, a sound no one had heard for decades. It was a voice from the past, dragging the town's forgotten secrets back into the light. Despite the late hour, Caleb found himself pulled toward the dilapidated church at the edge of town. The building loomed like a shadow against the thick fog, its steeple piercing the night sky. Windows long shattered, doors hanging crooked on their hinges, yet the old bell tower still stood, as if daring the years to erase its presence. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and decay, smelling of rotting wood and forgotten prayers. Moonlight seeped through the broken panes, casting eerie patterns on the pews. Caleb's footsteps echoed softly as he moved toward the altar, drawn by a mixture of dread and fascination. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a faded photograph, a black and white image of the Miller family smiling beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak. The faces looked innocent, but the eyes held something else, a shadow of sorrow, a secret too heavy to bear. As Caleb studied the photo, a sudden chill ran down his spine. The faint sound of whispered voices stirred in the shadows around him. He turned sharply, heart pounding, but saw only the empty pews and the dust motes dancing in the pale light. Suddenly the bell tolled again, 4 slow, measured strikes that seemed to shake the very air. Caleb covered his ears instinctively, but the sound lingered, haunting and persistent. His gaze fell on the pulpit, where a tattered book lay open. The pages were yellowed and brittle, inscribed with symbols that mirrored those he'd seen at the Miller farm. Arcane markings etched deep with an unsettling precision. His fingers trembled as he reached out to touch the book, feeling a faint pulse like a heartbeat trapped within the ink. As he flipped through the pages, Caleb discovered a passage describing an ancient ritual meant to protect the land from an unspecified evil. The text spoke of a guardian spirit, bound to the bloodline of the Millers, tasked with maintaining a fragile balance. It warned, however, that disturbing the ritual could awaken forces best left undisturbed. A noise from the back of the church made him freeze. The soft scrape of footsteps against stone, slow and deliberate. Caleb's breath hitched as he scanned the shadows. "Who's there?" he called out, voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. A figure stepped forward, a tall man in worn jeans and a sheriff's badge gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Deputy Harper. Caleb had met him briefly at the local diner, a man whose calm exterior barely masked a wary vigilance. "You shouldn't be here at this hour," Harper said quietly, eyes narrowing. "This town holds secrets that don't take kindly to strangers poking around." Caleb nodded, clutching the photograph tighter. "I'm trying to understand what happened to the Millers. Why the farm burned down, why everyone avoids this place." Harper sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You're digging into things better left alone. There's history here. Dark history. Stories about curses and blood debts. Some folks around here believe the land is cursed, that it's got a mind of its own. Caleb's curiosity flared. A curse? Harper's eyes darkened. Old family legends, the kind of tales passed down over campfires, whispered in hushed tones. Some say Agnes Miller made a deal, something to protect her family from harm, but every deal has a price. The weight of Harper's words settled heavily on Caleb. He was no longer just an outsider investigating a cold case. He had stepped into a living nightmare, tangled with history, superstition, and something far more sinister. Listen, Harper continued, glancing nervously over his shoulder. If you want to survive in Miller's Hollow, you need to respect the old ways. Don't stray into the forest after dark. Don't touch the ruins, and whatever you do, don't ignore the signs. Before Caleb could respond, the church bell tolled again, this time rapidly, 8 sharp clangs that echoed like a warning through the night. The atmosphere thickened. Caleb's skin prickled with unease as the whispered voices returned, swelling into a chorus of half-remembered prayers and warnings lost to time. As the bell's final echo faded, Caleb realized the full weight of the curse bearing down on him. Miller's Hollow was no ordinary town. It was a place where the past refused to die, where shadows hid in plain sight, and where every step forward meant diving deeper into darkness. Outside, the fog had thickened into a living wall, swallowing the church whole. Caleb stepped back, his resolve hardening. He was no longer just a visitor. He was part of the story now, and the curse was watching. The cold fog pressed thicker against Caleb as he stepped outside the crumbling church. Deputy Harper's warning echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. Respect the old ways. Avoid the forest at night. Don't touch the ruin. But the answers Caleb sought weren't going to reveal themselves through silence or fear. The town of Miller's Hollow seemed to hold its breath, cloaked in shadows and mist. Streetlights flickered weakly, their glow swallowed by the dense fog. Caleb glanced at the photograph again, tracing the faces of the Miller family. Their smiles frozen in time, but their eyes holding the secrets of this cursed land. He pocketed the photo and headed toward his truck, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, the only sound breaking the uneasy stillness. A sense of being watched prickled at the back of his neck. Every time he turned, the fog seemed to thicken, folding around the streets like a living thing. Caleb reached the edge of town where the forest began, a tangled mass of skeletal branches reaching skyward like claws. The trees whispered ancient warnings in the rustling breeze. The sheriff's words rang again. Don't stray into the forest after dark. But Caleb knew he had to. If the truth about the Millers, the fire, and the curse was hidden anywhere, it was buried deep within those woods. The moon was a sliver in the sky as he parked at the old Miller farm's edge. The land was scarred, charred earth where the house once stood, gnarled roots tangled with ash and bone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the crack of a dry branch underfoot. Caleb pulled his coat tighter and stepped forward, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. His flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on twisted remnants of what used to be a fence, the paint peeling and splintered. Suddenly, a faint light flickered ahead. A candle? He moved cautiously toward it, heart pounding. The light came from the base of the ancient oak in the center of the farm, its massive limbs stretched wide as if protecting the ground beneath. There, a small shrine had been set up. Candles burned low, casting wavering shadows on hastily scrawled symbols etched into the bark. A faded photograph of the Miller family lay at the base, surrounded by wildflowers and wilted leaves. A bark-rated buck? A faded photograph of the Miller family lay at the base, surrounded by wildflowers and wilted leaves. Caleb knelt, running a hand over the symbols. They matched the ones from the church book. Arcane, ritualistic, protective, yet ominous. He could almost feel the residue of something powerful lingering in the air. A presence that was watching, waiting. A sudden rustling from the underbrush jolted him upright. He spun, shining his light into the trees, but saw only darkness and shifting shadows. Then, the unmistakable sound of whispering, soft, incoherent, just beyond understanding. "Who's there?" Caleb called, voice steady but edged with tension. Silence answered him. He took a step back, but the whispering grew louder, circling him like a predator stalking prey. The cold settled deeper into his bones, and for a moment, Caleb's mind raced with the stories Harper had told. The curse, the blood debts, the deals made in desperation. It was then that he noticed the ground beneath the oak. Disturbed soil, freshly turned. Something had been buried, or unburied. Caleb dropped to his knees and began to dig with his hands, fingers scraping against cold earth. Minutes passed like hours until his fingers brushed against something solid, a rusted tin box, heavy and locked tight. His breath quickened as he pried it open with a rock. Inside, folded papers yellowed with age, a leather-bound journal, and a small silver locket lay nestled among dried herbs and strange tokens. The journal's cover was cracked, but inside the pages revealed a desperate tale. Written in hurried, jagged script was the story of Agnes Miller, matriarch of the family, rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals to protect her kin. The entry spoke of fear, sacrifices, and an unholy pact made under a blood moon. Caleb's fingers trembled as he turned the pages, reading of nights filled with chanting, strange rites beneath the oak, and a shadowy figure who came in exchange for safety. A guardian spirit bound by blood and curse. Suddenly, the temperature around him plummeted. His breath fogged the air as a chill swept through the clearing. The flickering candles at the shrine guttered and died, plunging Caleb into darkness, save for his shaky flashlight beam. A whisper floated through the trees. A voice, low and mournful. "You shouldn't have come back." Caleb froze, heart thudding wildly. The shadows seemed to gather, coalescing into shapes just beyond the reach of his light. He scrambled to his feet, clutching the journal and locket tightly, the weight of centuries pressing down on him. As he hurried back toward his truck, the whispering followed, a chorus of voices layered with sorrow and menace. Branches cracked and unseen eyes glimmered in the darkness. Reaching the edge of the forest, Caleb dared one last glance back. There, beneath the ancient oak, a figure stood. Tall, cloaked in shadow, its presence impossible to ignore. The Guardian. And it was watching. Caleb slammed the truck door shut, engine roaring to life as he sped away, but the feeling lingered. Miller's Hollow was far from done with him. The curse had awakened, and it was hungry. The cold, relentless rain hammered against the cracked windows of the Miller's Hollow Historical Society building, each drop a sharp reminder that some things never truly wash away. Caleb sat alone under the dim glow of a flickering lamp. The journal's brittle pages spread before him like a map to a forgotten nightmare. Outside, the town was silent, save for the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the Appalachian hills. Inside, shadows danced on the walls, twisting and writhing as if trying to break free from the confines of peeling paint and weathered wood. Caleb's eyes scanned the worn script, the words blurring together in the dim light, yet the urgency in Agnes Miller's handwriting cut through the haze like a scream. She wrote of rituals performed under the blood moon, binding spirits that refused to rest, of sacrifices made in desperation, friends, neighbors, family, offered to appease a presence that demanded more than reverence. The more Caleb read, the heavier the weight in his chest grew, a suffocating dread that gnawed at his resolve. A sudden noise startled him, a sharp knock at the heavy wooden door. His heart leapt as he reached for the flashlight on the table, fingers trembling. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Who's there?" Caleb called out, voice cracking slightly. No answer, only the soft patter of rain against the roof. He rose cautiously, stepping toward the door. Peering through the grimy window, he saw a figure silhouetted against the streetlight. A woman, soaked to the bone, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Please," she whispered, voice barely audible over the storm. "You have to help me. It's happening again." Caleb hesitated. The air grew thick, charged with something ancient and foreboding. With a deep breath, he unlatched the door and pulled it open. The woman stepped inside, eyes wide and haunted. "My name's Evelyn. I grew up here. I've seen what's been unleashed." Her gaze flicked nervously toward the stacks of old books and papers. "That curse, it never left." Caleb motioned her to sit as she wrung her hands, water dripping onto the worn wooden floor. "What do you mean happening again?" Evelyn swallowed hard, voice trembling. "There have been disappearances, people vanishing near the forest's edge, strange lights, whispers in the dark, the same signs my grandmother told me about. The guardian has returned." Caleb's mind raced, back to the shadow beneath the ancient oak, the chilling whispers in the night. "The guardian, you believe it's tied to the Miller curse?" She nodded. "It's not just a story. The rituals, the blood debts, they've been disturbed, and whatever was bound is breaking free." He pulled out the journal, flipping to a passage marked with a faded red symbol. "This talks about a ritual to contain the spirit, but it also warns of dire consequences if broken." Evelyn's eyes darkened. "That's the problem. Someone has tampered with the shrine. The protections are failing." The room seemed to close in as Caleb absorbed the gravity of her words. Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling like a chorus of lost souls. "Have you been to the farm recently?" he asked. Evelyn hesitated. "Yes, a few nights ago. I tried to restore the shrine, but something stopped me. I felt eyes watching, and then the ground near the oak started moving, like something was trying to claw its way out." A shiver ran down Caleb's spine. "We need to find out who's behind this. If the curse is unraveling, no one in Miller's Hollow is safe." Evelyn reached into her coat pocket, producing an old, tarnished key. "I think this might help. It belonged to my grandmother. She said it opens a hidden chamber beneath the farm, a place where the curse began." Caleb took the key, its cold metal biting into his palm. "Then that's where we're headed at first light." As the night deepened, the flickering lamp cast long shadows across the room. Caleb felt the weight of history pressing down, the invisible eyes of the past watching his every move. The curse was no longer a distant tale. It was alive, waiting to consume anyone foolish enough to challenge it. Outside, lightning cracked, illuminating the twisted branches of the forest like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. Somewhere beyond the veil of rain and darkness, the guardian stirred once more. The dawn crept slowly over Miller's Hollow, casting a gray, hesitant light across the tangled underbrush surrounding the old Miller farm. Caleb and Evelyn moved cautiously through the thicket, the heavy silence pressing in on them, broken only by the occasional crunch of dead leaves beneath their boots. The chill of the morning seeped through their coats, but it was nothing compared to the cold dread clinging to Caleb's thoughts. The key in Caleb's pocket felt heavier with each step, its metallic weight a reminder of the secret it promised to unlock. Evelyn glanced around nervously, her eyes scanning the shadowed edges of the forest, as if expecting something or someone to emerge at any moment. "This place used to be alive," she murmured. "Now it feels like it's waiting for something worse." They reached the edge of the clearing where the remnants of the old farmhouse stood like a skeletal monument to forgotten pain. The wooden beams were warped and splintered, windows shattered and blackened by decades of neglect. A faint, acrid scent lingered in the air. Smoke? Decay? Caleb couldn't tell, but it gnawed at his senses. Evelyn moved ahead, pulling a flashlight from her bag as they approached the basement door, half buried beneath rubble and wild vines. The key found its lock with a reluctant twist, the ancient mechanism groaning in protest as the door creaked open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Caleb swallowed hard, heart pounding as he followed Evelyn down the steps. The air grew colder, heavier, saturated with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, bitter, almost alive. Their flashlight beams pierced the thick blackness, revealing walls etched with strange symbols and faded warnings. "This must be it," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "The place where the curse began." Deeper into the cellar, they found what looked like an altar, its stone surface stained with dried blood and strange powders. Scattered around it were relics, fragments of broken bones, twisted roots, and a small leather-bound book, its cover cracked and faded. Caleb reached for the book, careful not to disturb the altar's morbid arrangement. Opening it, he found a series of cryptic incantations and drawings that matched the symbols on the walls. The language was archaic, yet a terrible clarity filled him as he deciphered the grim instructions. A ritual to bind a restless spirit, a guardian bound by blood and sacrifice, cursed to roam the land until appeased. Suddenly, a low guttural growl echoed through the chamber, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. Caleb spun toward the stairs, but Evelyn was frozen, eyes wide in terror. From the shadows, a figure emerged, hulking, indistinct, its form shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. Its eyes, twin embers of malevolence, fixed on them with ancient hatred. "You should not have come," a voice hissed, cold and whispering, curling around them like a winter wind. Caleb stepped forward, gripping the book tightly. "We're here to end this, to stop the curse." The creature laughed, a sound like bones grinding together. "End? You know nothing of the price." A sudden crash from above jolted them both. Dust and debris rained down as the old farmhouse trembled violently. The spirit let out an ear-splitting screech, advancing. Desperation surged through Caleb. He remembered the incantation, the warnings. Together they began to chant, voices trembling but growing stronger with each word. The air thickened, charged with raw energy, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly. The spirit writhed, its form unraveling, pulling at the bonds that had held it captive for centuries. Yet as the final words left their lips, a terrifying realization struck Caleb. The ritual was not to end the curse, but to transfer it. The creature's laughter echoed one last time before it vanished, leaving behind a cold silence that pressed into Caleb's bones. Evelyn looked at him with hollow eyes. "The curse, it's inside one of us now." Before Caleb could respond, a shadow flickered at the staircase entrance. A figure standing silently, watching, waiting. The key in Caleb's hand grew unbearably hot, burning with a dark promise. And somewhere beyond the crumbling walls, the forest seemed to lean in closer, whispering secrets only the cursed could hear. The night fell heavy over Miller's Hollow, wrapping the town in an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting long shadows that danced against the cracked pavement and weathered wooden porches. Inside the small sheriff's office, Caleb sat hunched over a cluttered desk, the dim lamp struggling against the darkness pressing through the grimy window. His fingers trembled as they traced the faded map of the surrounding woods, where secrets older than the town itself lay buried. "Sometimes," Caleb muttered, "the past doesn't want to stay buried." He glanced up as Sheriff Reynolds entered the room, his weathered face lined with exhaustion and worry. "We've got reports," Reynolds said grimly. "More disappearances on the edge of town. Folks say they hear chanting near the old mill at night." Caleb nodded, the weight of the curse pressing heavier with each passing day. The events at the Miller farm had shaken him, but this spreading darkness was something far more sinister. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," he replied, "before more people vanish." That evening, Caleb met Evelyn at the local historical society, a modest building crammed with dusty books and forgotten relics. Their search for answers had become a desperate race against time. Evelyn's eyes scanned an old ledger as Caleb carefully examined a collection of faded photographs, showing the town in its early days, faces frozen in sepia, places swallowed by time. "They called it the Blackwood Ritual," Evelyn whispered, tracing the words in a brittle diary she had uncovered. "A secret society formed in the late 1800s, dedicated to controlling the spirit world. They believed the forest held power to protect or destroy." Caleb's gaze darkened. "And the Miller family?" "Central to it all, the last known practitioners. But something went wrong. The ritual backfired and the curse was unleashed. The deeper they delved, the more unsettling the picture became. Stories of neighbors disappearing without a trace, whispered warnings of a presence that watched from the shadows. A local preacher's journal spoke of unnatural voices that called through the trees, and strange symbols carved into the bark of ancient oaks. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the faint echo of chanting, low and rhythmic, like the pulse of a forgotten heartbeat. Caleb shivered, feeling the invisible tendrils of dread creep up his spine. That night, unable to rest, Caleb returned to the farmhouse ruins, drawn by a compulsion he could neither explain nor resist. The moon hung low, a pale eye watching over the desolation. As he stepped into the clearing, the ground beneath seemed to pulse softly, alive with an ancient energy. In the shadows, figures cloaked in dark robes moved silently, encircling a smoldering fire that threw twisted shapes onto the gnarled trees. Their faces were hidden, but their voices rose in a haunting chant, words old as time itself, stirring the restless earth. Caleb's breath caught. He wasn't supposed to be here. He should have turned away, but the lure of the ritual's power held him captive. From the fire, a figure stepped forward, tall, commanding, radiating a malevolence that chilled the air. "You seek the truth," the figure intoned, voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "But truth demands sacrifice." Before Caleb could react, the shadows converged, hands cold as grave soil seizing him. The chanting grew louder, a cacophony of despair and power intertwined. In that moment, Caleb glimpsed the true cost of the curse. Not just the loss of life, but the corruption of souls, twisted by a hunger that no mortal could quell. As the fire blazed higher, the forest seemed to close in, the line between the living and the dead blurring into a nightmare from which there was no waking. The last thing Caleb saw before darkness claimed him was a symbol burned into his skin, a mark not of salvation, but of eternal bondage. And somewhere, beneath the whispering trees, the curse awaited its next victim. The oppressive silence of the forest seemed to tighten around Caleb as he struggled against the cold, unyielding grip of the robed figures. The chanting's cadence grew relentless, an ancient dirge that echoed from the depths of the trees and clawed at his mind. Every word felt like a dagger, slicing through reason, pulling him closer to a darkness older than the town itself. Yet amid the terror, a fierce resolve flared within him. This curse would not claim him quietly. His hands, trembling but determined, clenched into fists. With a sudden surge of strength, Caleb twisted free from one of the hands holding him and darted toward the flickering tree line. Branches scratched at his face and arms, but he pushed forward, driven by a desperate need to survive and to expose the truth behind Miller's Hollow's nightmare. Emerging from the forest's edge, Caleb stumbled into the cold light of dawn. The robed figures had vanished, leaving no trace but the lingering smoke and a symbol scorched into the earth where the fire had burned. That mark, a twisted sigil, pulsed faintly, an unspoken promise that the curse was far from over. Back in town, Caleb sought out Evelyn at the Historical Society, his mind racing with fragments of the night's ordeal. She was waiting, surrounded by stacks of dusty tomes and yellowed papers, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "We have to stop this," Caleb said, voice hoarse but steady. "Whatever that ritual is, it's still active. Those people, if that's what they are, they won't stop until Miller's Hollow is consumed." Evelyn nodded, found more references to the Blackwood ritual, mentions of an ancient pact with a spirit they called the Hollow One. It said to feed on fear and pain, growing stronger with every soul trapped beneath the trees. The weight of that knowledge settled over them like a shroud. This wasn't just a local legend, it was a living nightmare, woven into the very roots of their home. Caleb's thoughts turned to the missing. Neighbors, friends, people swallowed by the darkness without explanation. He pictured their faces, empty eyes, silent cries for help that had never reached anyone. The curse was a predator, and Miller's Hollow was its hunting ground. "We need to warn the others," Caleb said, "but how do you fight something that's part of the land itself?" Evelyn pulled a battered journal from the pile, its leather cover cracked and worn. "There might be a way, a counter-ritual. something the original society tried to suppress, but it requires a sacrifice, and it's dangerous. We don't even know if it will work. That night, Caleb and Evelyn gathered a small group of trusted townsfolk, the sheriff, a local preacher, and a few brave souls willing to stand against the encroaching darkness. In the flickering candlelight of the church basement, they pored over the ancient texts, searching for hope amid the dread. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal branches, carrying with it whispers that sounded almost human. Calls from the cursed forest, promises of power and ruin. As the group debated, a sudden crash echoed from above. The heavy wooden door slammed open, and a figure burst inside, eyes wild with terror and desperation. "It's happening again," the man gasped. "The woods, they're alive. People are disappearing. The chanting. It's closer. We don't have much time." Panic rippled through the room. Caleb's heart hammered. The curse was awakening fully, its hunger unleashed. The preacher stepped forward, clutching a worn cross. "We face a darkness older than any of us, but faith and courage can be weapons. We must prepare for a fight not just for our lives, but for our souls." Caleb nodded, his gaze hardening. The battle was just beginning. Later, as the town's lights flickered and dimmed under the growing shadow, Caleb returned to his home. A modest wooden house on the outskirts, its walls holding memories both comforting and haunted. Alone, he traced the scar where the ritual's mark had branded him, a searing reminder that he was no longer just an observer. The curse had claimed a part of him. Suddenly, a soft tapping came from the window. Caleb froze, breath caught in his throat. Slowly he turned, eyes searching the darkened glass. Outside, just beyond the reach of the porch light, a pale figure stood motionless. Its eyes glowed faintly, empty yet piercing, like cold embers in the night. Caleb's blood ran cold. Before he could react, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving only a whisper hanging in the air. A chilling promise. "You belong to the forest now." And with that, the night swallowed the silence once more, deeper and darker than before. The wind carried an unsettling chill through Miller's Hollow, sharper and more insistent than ever before, as if the very air conspired to whisper secrets only the cursed could hear. Caleb stood at the edge of the forest once again, the oppressive darkness pressing against him like a living thing, heavier this time, pregnant with something yet unseen but deeply felt. The past weeks had worn him thin, the sleepless nights haunted by shadowed figures, the weight of every whispered legend now manifesting in twisted, tangible horrors. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the forest's silence was shattered by a low, guttural hum, an ancient vibration that stirred the roots beneath his feet and tugged at the frayed edges of his sanity. Determined, Caleb took a steadying breath and stepped into the tangled undergrowth. Every crackle of dead leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. His pulse quickened, but the resolve burning within him outweighed the gnawing dread. Deeper into the woods, the familiar symbols carved into tree trunks loomed larger and more frequent. The sigils from the Blackwood ritual, scorched into bark and soil, pulsed faintly with a sickly green glow under the moonlight. They seemed to pulse with life, an eerie heartbeat syncing with his eye. Shadows coalesced into a shape, slender, cloaked in tattered robes, face obscured beneath a hood that seemed to drink the light. The figure's presence was suffocating, a void pulling at Caleb's very soul. "Why do you come here, Caleb?" a voice rasped, ancient and hollow, echoing from the figure, yet somehow reverberating inside his mind. "The forest is not kind to those who seek answers." Swallowing his fear, Caleb stepped forward. "Because the curse is growing. The people I care about, my family, the town, they're all in danger. This ends tonight." The figure chuckled, a sound like dry leaves scraping over stone. "Ends? No, boy, it begins. The Hollow One hungers, and with each breath you take, you feed its hunger." Caleb's hands clenched into fists, the weight of his scars burning anew. "Then I'll starve it." Without warning, the robed figure raised a trembling hand, and the forest around Caleb shifted. The trees groaned, roots twisting like serpents, the ground trembling beneath his feet. Tendrils of shadow erupted from the earth, snaking toward him with unnatural speed. He dodged, heart pounding, weaving through the thick woods as the darkness clawed at his skin. Memories flashed. Evelyn's warnings, the preacher's prayers, the desperate faces of the townsfolk. This was no mere legend. This was a war for survival. As Caleb ran, a faint glow appeared ahead, a ring of stones, ancient and weathered, half swallowed by moss and time. This was the heart of the Blackwood ritual site, the epicenter of the curse's power. He knew what had to be done. Inside the stone circle, Caleb found remnants of old offerings, withered flowers, broken candles, and a journal bound in cracked leather. Flipping through the fragile pages, he deciphered the counter ritual, a desperate hope buried in archaic script. But the cost was clear, a sacrifice, not just blood, but a piece of the soul, a torment no man could endure lightly. Determined to end the nightmare, Caleb began the incantation, his voice trembling but unwavering. The forest responded. The air thickened, the ground pulsed, and the shadows hissed in rage. Suddenly a scream pierced the night. Evelyn's voice, raw and desperate, calling for help. Caleb's heart lurched. The battle was far from over. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the robed figure reappeared, eyes blazing with malevolent fire. "You cannot undo what has been bound for centuries." Caleb met the gaze, voice fierce. "Maybe not, but I can stop you from taking any more." The ground erupted in a blinding flash, the forest screaming in agony and fury. Caleb felt himself pulled between worlds, light and shadow, life and death. When the chaos subsided, he was alone, panting, the stones cold beneath his hands. The forest was silent, but a lingering darkness clung to the edges of his vision, a reminder that some evils never truly die. And then, from the shadows, a whisper. "The Hollow One is patient. It waits." Caleb's breath caught. The fight had only just begun. The first rays of dawn barely penetrated the dense canopy of Blackwood forest, yet Caleb's mind burned bright with urgency and dread. The remnants of the ritual lingered in the air, like a bitter aftertaste, and though the forest seemed quieter, an ominous weight pressed heavier than ever on his chest. He knew the fight wasn't over. Far from it. The Hollow One's patience was endless, and its hunger unyielding. Exhausted but resolute, Caleb retraced his steps toward the town. The familiar landscape now alien and hostile. Every rustle in the underbrush, every distant hoot or snap of a twig sent his nerves into a frenzy. The villagers awaited him, their eyes haunted, desperate for answers and salvation, but Caleb felt the chilling truth settle in. Salvation might come at a price no one was ready to pay. Back in the weathered town hall, Caleb convened with the sheriff and a handful of trusted townsfolk, including Evelyn, who was still recovering from the night's terrors. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Harper, listened intently as Caleb relayed everything. The ancient ritual, the shadowy figure, the sacrifice required. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd, disbelief mingling with a growing fear. "We've lived under this curse for generations," Harper said grimly. "Our ancestors tried to bury it, but darkness doesn't stay hidden forever. Whatever it is, it's tied to this land and our blood." Evelyn nodded weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. The Blackwood ritual was meant to contain it, not end it. We can delay the Hollow One's hunger, but we can't stop it without a price. No one has to make a sacrifice. Give part of themselves so the rest of us can live. A heavy silence followed, the weight of impossible choices settling in. Caleb felt the eyes turn toward him. They knew he was the one who had uncovered the truth, and now, the one they expected to act. As the morning wore on, Caleb's mind raced through the options. Ritual's text hinted at a way to seal the Hollow One, but it demanded a sacrifice far greater than he had imagined. Something that would scar not just the body, but the very soul. Could he, a man already haunted by loss and betrayal, bear such a burden? Later, as he wandered near the old cemetery on the town's edge, memories of his family flooded back. The laughter of his sister, the stern but loving gaze of his father, now all stolen by this curse. The wind picked up, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to brush his ear. The price must be paid. Suddenly, the earth beneath the cemetery trembled faintly. A chill ran down Caleb's spine. From the shadows of the weathered tombstones, figures began to emerge, ghostly, twisted visages of those lost to the Hollow One's hunger, their eyes empty voids that held both sorrow and rage. Caleb's breath hitched as he realized the restless spirits weren't just victims. They were prisoners, bound to the curse, forever trapped between worlds. One figure stepped forward, a woman draped in tattered white, her face both familiar and unknowable. "You seek to end this," she said, voice echoing like wind through the graves. "But endings are beginnings. The curse lives because it feeds on pain and sacrifice. What will you give, Caleb? What part of your soul will you trade for their release?" He staggered back, heart pounding. The words were a cruel mirror to his own torment. His past sins, his guilt for those lost, and the heavy burden of hope resting on his shoulders. In the days that followed, Caleb threw himself into preparations. The townsfolk gathered, performing rites both old and new, desperate to bind the curse once more. Yet, with every attempt, the forest responded with greater fury. Trees groaning, animals fleeing, shadows stretching longer as night deepened. One evening, as Caleb pored over the ancient journal beneath flickering candlelight, a sudden knock shattered the silence. At the door stood Harper, his face pale and grim. "It's Evelyn," he said. "She's gone missing, last seen near the edge of Blackwood, near the old ritual site." Fear clawed at Caleb's chest. Evelyn was their link to the past, the one who understood the rituals and the dangers. Losing her now could mean disaster. Caleb grabbed his coat and rushed into the night, the forest swallowing him whole. Branches clawed at his face. Roots tripped him, but he pressed forward, guided by a faint, eerie glow pulsating through the trees. Near the heart of the forest, he found her. Evelyn, trapped in a circle of ancient stones, eyes wide with terror. Shadows writhed around her, dark tendrils reaching out, trying to drag her into the abyss. "Caleb, don't come closer," she cried, struggling against unseen forces. "The Hollow One is stronger than ever. It knows we're trying to fight it." Without hesitation, Caleb stepped into the circle, chanting the counter ritual with every ounce of strength he had left. The shadows recoiled, but surged again, fierce and relentless. In a flash, the ground beneath them cracked open, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. Caleb felt the pull, the desperate hunger of the Hollow One threatening to consume them both. Summoning his last reserves of willpower, he grasped Evelyn's hand, and together they recited the final words. Words that bound light to shadow, hope to despair. The maw snapped shut, and the shadows fled, leaving the forest eerily silent. But as Caleb caught his breath, he noticed Evelyn's eyes. The light had faded, replaced by a cold emptiness that chilled him to the bone. "Evelyn?" he whispered. She turned slowly, a hollow smile curling on her lips. "The price has been paid," she said softly, "but it's not over." Behind her, the forest seemed to pulse with a new darkness, deeper and more malevolent than before. Caleb's heart sank. The curse had evolved. The Hollow One was no longer just a lurking shadow. It had found a way inside, and it wore Evelyn's face. As the first tendrils of dawn broke through the twisted branches, Caleb realized the true horror was only beginning. The fight for Miller's Hollow was far from over. The oppressive silence of Miller's Hollow hung heavy in the pre-dawn air, as if the very earth was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. Caleb stood alone on the cracked porch of the old church, the weight of the past weeks pressing down like a storm cloud ready to break. The town had changed. Shadows clung to every corner, and the coldness that seeped through the cracked windows wasn't just from the chill of early morning. He traced the weathered edges of the church's peeling paint, his thoughts spiraling back to the warnings carved into the margins of the ritual texts he'd painstakingly translated. The Hollow One was no longer a distant nightmare lurking in the woods. It had become a parasite within his very community, feeding off fear, pain, and betrayal. And now it wore the face of someone he once trusted. Caleb's mind flickered to Evelyn. Her empty gaze, the hollow smile that sent chills down his spine. The thought of her, once a beacon of hope and knowledge, now twisted by the darkness, was a wound that refused to heal. Yet amidst the despair, a fierce determination burned inside him. This curse, this evil born from forgotten sins and ancient rituals, would not claim the last light of Miller's Hollow without a fight. The church's heavy wooden doors groaned as Caleb pushed them open, stepping inside the dim sanctuary. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light piercing through stained glass, casting fractured rainbows on the cracked stone floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and faded incense, mingling with the distant echoes of whispered prayers and mourning. At the altar, a circle of salt and candles flickered weakly, remnants of a protective ward hastily erected by the remaining townsfolk. Caleb knelt, hands trembling slightly as he traced the ancient sigils drawn from the ritual text. His voice barely rose above a whisper as he began the incantation, the words foreign, yet hauntingly familiar, a desperate plea to forces unseen. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows, carrying with it the mournful cries of the lost and the damned. Caleb could feel the presence closing in, the darkness pooling like ink, eager to engulf the fragile sanctuary. His heart pounded, the line between courage and terror blurring as shadows twisted and writhed beyond the threshold. Suddenly, a sharp knock shattered the silence. Urgent, deliberate. Caleb's breath caught. He wasn't alone. The door creaked open, revealing Sheriff Harper's gaunt face, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and fear. Behind him, a small group of townsfolk followed, clutching relics and talismans scavenged from generations past. "We don't have much time," Harper said, voice tight. "The Hollow One's grip is tightening. We need to complete the ritual tonight, or we lose everything." Caleb nodded, steeling himself. Together, they formed a circle around the altar. Hands joined, voices rising in unison as the incantation grew stronger. The candles flickered wildly, shadows stretching and twisting like living things desperate to break free. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and a chilling howl echoed from the forest outside. An unholy scream that spoke of rage, hunger, and ancient wrath. Caleb's vision blurred. The room seemed to spin as unseen forces tore at the veil separating their world from the abyss. Memories flashed through Caleb's mind, his family lost to this curse, the countless sacrifices made by those before him, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe this time, it could end. But as the final words left their lips, a sudden, bone-deep cold seized the room. The candles snuffed out, plunging them into darkness. In the silence that followed, Caleb felt a whisper brush his ear. A voice, not his own, cold and mocking. "This is only the beginning." The protective circle shattered, and shadows surged forward like a tidal wave. Caleb's scream was swallowed by the void as the darkness claimed Miller's Hollow once more. The cold, unyielding darkness swallowed Miller's Hollow in the aftermath of the shattered ritual. Caleb lay motionless on the cold stone floor, the echoes of that chilling voice lingering like a poison in his mind. The weight of despair pressed down as the shadows receded, revealing a scene fractured and broken. The church, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, haunted by failures and lost hopes. But Caleb's spirit refused to surrender. Every breath was a battle against the creeping numbness. Every heartbeat a stubborn defiance of the void that sought to consume him. Slowly, his fingers twitched, then curled, gripping the rough wood beneath him. He pushed himself upright, wincing as pain radiated through his body, wounds both physical and invisible. Around him, the survivors stirred, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Sheriff Harper stood, his jaw clenched tight, the weight of leadership etched into every line of his face. "It's not over," Caleb rasped, voice hoarse but resolute. "We have to finish this. We have to end it." They gathered what remained of their strength and willpower, retreating from the desecrated church to the edge of the forest, the heart of the Hollow One's domain. The woods were thick with an unnatural silence, branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands, and the earth beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent life. Memories of whispered warnings and half-forgotten legends crowded Caleb's mind. The Hollow One was not just a creature of flesh and shadow. It was a curse bound by ancient bloodlines, a darkness that had festered through generations. Its hunger was insatiable, its power fed by fear and betrayal. Evelyn's face haunted him, her smile, once warm and familiar, now twisted by the darkness that had claimed her. The painful truth settled. To fight this evil, sacrifices would be inevitable, and not all would survive the night. With trembling hands, Caleb unfurled the worn map he had found in the town archives. A faded, fragile thing, marked with cryptic symbols and routes leading deep into the forest. The final ritual, the one that could sever the curse's hold, required a journey to the old burial ground, a place forsaken by time and touched by the darkest shadows of history. As they ventured deeper, the air grew thick with a cold that seeped into their bones, and an oppressive sense of dread clung to them like a second skin. Strange sounds echoed. Whispers, rustling leaves, the faintest hint of laughter, mocking and cruel. The group moved cautiously, every step a test of nerve. Shadows danced just beyond the reach of their lanterns, shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The line between reality and nightmare blurred. Suddenly, from the darkness, a scream shattered the tense silence. It was Harper. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, eyes wide with a terror that no words could explain. Caleb rushed to his side, but Harper's voice was barely a whisper. "It's coming. Closer." Panic surged, but Caleb forced calm. The ritual had to be completed. This was their only hope. They pressed forward, finally reaching the burial ground, a clearing marked by crumbling stones and twisted trees. The ground was scarred with ancient symbols etched in blood-red clay, the remnants of rituals long past. Caleb began the incantation, voice steady despite the storm raging inside. Flames erupted from the candles arranged in a precise circle, casting eerie light on the surrounding trees. The air vibrated with power as the Hollow One stirred, its presence a suffocating shadow pressing in on all sides. Then, a figure emerged. Evelyn, or what she had become. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her voice was a distorted echo of the woman he once knew. "Why fight, Caleb? Join me. Embrace the darkness. It is eternal." Caleb's heart shattered, but his resolve hardened. Never. With a cry, the final battle erupted. Light against shadow, hope against despair. The earth trembled, the sky roared, and the fate of Miller's Hollow hung by a thread. As the ritual reached its climax, Caleb's vision blurred. The last thing he saw was Evelyn's face, a flicker of sorrow before the darkness consumed her. When the light faded, silence fell once more. Caleb awoke alone, the forest eerily quiet. The ritual had ended, but the cost was unimaginable. Miller's Hollow was gone, burned to ash, erased from maps and memory. But in the distance, a faint, chilling whisper drifted on the wind. This curse never truly dies, and with it came a new shadow, stretching beyond the Hollow, reaching toward the world beyond. The nightmare was far from over. Thank you so much for joining me on this chilling journey into the heart of Miller's Hollow. I hope this story sent shivers down your spine and left you looking over your shoulder just a little more carefully tonight. If you enjoyed this tale of darkness, curses, and the unknown, please consider liking, subscribing, and hitting that notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming horror stories. Your support means the world and helps keep these creepy legends alive. Remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't what we see, but what lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. Stay curious, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay safe out there. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.